We acknowledge that the University of Michigan, named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system and located in the Huron River watershed, was formed and has grown through connection with a land stewarded by Niswi, Ishkidawan, Anishinabeg, the Three Fires people, who are the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Fedele F and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Lecture, Child Trafficking and Child Safety. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you are interested in receiving CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentations. You will see the first two momentarily. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat. We do encourage participation in the chat throughout the lecture. We're going to wait just a few moments before we get started, so sit tight and remember to respond to the polls when you see them. Here is your first poll question. You should see it pop up in a separate window from Zoom. If the poll function is not working for you, please go ahead and put your response in the chat. If anyone is interested in elaborating a little bit more on who they are and what brought you to this lecture, please feel free to populate the chat. We always love to see who is in this virtual space with us since we can't see each other's faces.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beth Angel, and I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Fedele F and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Lecture. Now, before I thank the Fauri family and introduce this year's topic of child trafficking and child safety, I would like to take a moment to pay tribute to Professor Emerita Rosemary Seri, a beloved member of the Michigan social work community who passed away on July 25th. Rosemary was a leading authority in child welfare issues, and she had a long history with this lecture series. For many years, she played an active role in the Fauri lecture planning. At this time, I would like to introduce alumna Amy Good, a UM School of Social Work alumna, class of 1980, who will speak to Rosemary's legacy and impact. Amy knew Rosemary for over 40 years. She was a student of Rosemary's, both as an undergraduate studying psychology and later as an MSW student, and that friendship continued through the end of Rosemary's life. Amy is also a member of our alumni board and was a recipient of the school's Distinguished Alumni Award in 2014. Professionally, Amy is one of the founders and the CEO of Alternatives for Girls in Detroit. Alternatives for Girls works to help homeless and high-risk girls and young women avoid violence, teen pregnancy and exploitation, and help them to explore and access the support, resources, and opportunities necessary to be safe, to grow strong, and to make positive choices in their lives. During her lifetime, Rosemary was deeply inspired by Amy's vision and the work of Alternatives for Girls. It's my pleasure to invite Amy to share a brief tribute about Rosemary Seri. Amy?
Thank you, Dean Angel and all, for the honor of being able to offer a tribute to Dr. Rosemary Seri. I am so fortunate to have been a forever student of Rosemary's, her mentee, colleague, and friend. And I'm fully aware that I'm just one of many such students and mentees of Rosemary's all over the state of Michigan and well beyond, who've been blessed with Rosemary's challenging mentorship, her analyses of policy and justice issues, her support, guidance, and love. Truly, it never surprises me to encounter colleagues in the work for social justice, especially for at-risk youth, and to find that they are fellow SORs, or of course, students of Rosemary's. Dr. Seri's life was so full, so powerful, so impactful that it really is a challenge to try to capture its essence. I realize that while many present have known Rosemary well and worked closely with her, Some may not know who she was, so I'll begin with some basics. I want to also thank Dr. Kathleen Fowler, who had planned to join me in this tribute, but was unable to do so. I'm including the history that she provided. I'm also borrowing from the obituary shared by Dr. Sari's family on the occasion of her funeral 2 months ago. So first, a quick overview of Dr. Sari's life. Second, a summary of her huge professional accomplishments and impact. And third, I want to address something about who she was from my own perspective. All this in 10 minutes. Rosemary grew up during the Great Depression on a farm in Minnesota. Life was difficult due to community level poverty, but she took great strength from the foundation of a loving and strong family and a fierce commitment to education inspired by her mother. She was a dedicated feminist who broke ceilings in higher education. She was one of the first students to receive her PhD from U of M's joint program in both social work and sociology in 1962. She served as a lecturer throughout her doctoral studies and became an assistant professor, then full professor. She became a strong advocate for this and other joint programs, recognizing that this collaboration between schools was a significant factor in both the joint program and the school social work being rated #1. She served in many important administrative positions at the school, including head of the doctoral program, director of admissions, and head of the Social Welfare Administration program. Her many honors include a Fulbright Senior Scholarship, Lifetime Achievement Award from the Council on Social Work Education, School Social Work Distinguished Alumni Award, NASW Presidential Award for Research, and U of M Distinguished Faculty Achievement Award. She was named Professor Emerita of Social Work in 1993, at which time the Rosemary Sari Scholarship was established. I believe that she would cite her role as teacher and mentor to so many as her most cherished professional identity. Dr. Sari was a social work and social justice pioneer. In Kathleen Fowler's words, she was an innovator in social group work and often, together with Dr. Robert Vintner, conducted and published scores of research documents regarding juvenile corrections, disproportionate representation of adults and children of color in the correctional system, women in corrections, and group work approaches to public education. She was a strong advocate for social justice, equitable access to resources, and especially social work education, truly throughout the world, with an emphasis on Ann Arbor, lifting up the Student Advocacy Center, and Detroit, with Alternatives for Girls, and countless social work education and social justice programs in Europe, Asia, Russia, and Africa. Her research led to groundbreaking national policy changes that improved the juvenile justice system and led the U.S. Supreme Court to end the practice of housing youth with incarcerated adults. Rosemary Sari was a force of nature. She always believed that there was more work to be done to make this a more just world, up to the end. Her dedicated mentorship, tireless commitment, and groundbreaking work had a huge impact and spawned a generation of social workers and community advocates who will carry on her legacy. As I said, I'm just one of countless students of Rosemary's who were privileged to walk with her, learn from her, and borrow from her vision. But as one, I can share my personal experience of who she was for me and for our important work in Detroit. She introduced me to critical concepts and insights that hugely influenced my entire career trajectory, including the fact that some of our social systems are so deeply flawed that they can't just be reformed. They must be overhauled. She was one of the first people I called upon to advise me when I, as a resident of Southwest Detroit and part of a growing group of neighbors who were alarmed at the growing number of girls and young women who were in harm's way, needed some guidance about how we could create impact, starting off with zero financial resources. She contributed to the original ideas behind the creation of Alternatives for Girls. Rosemary served on our board of directors for many years and helped us launch a groundbreaking project, helping to prepare at-risk Detroit girls and young women for college and career success in innovative ways as part of Alternatives for Girls overall. Rosemary invested in herself mightily in AFG's mission, and incredible support from me and AFG. Her greatest impact at AFG was to create and launch this asset building project. Rosemary didn't want to help people beat the odds. She wanted to change the odds, and she did. AFG's asset building project helps Detroit girls and young women who are dealing with a wide range of risk factors prepare for middle and high school success, graduation, and education beyond high school. They tour campuses, save money, which is matched by donors and tax-protected college savings accounts. They engage with mentors and tutors. They learn literacy skills along with their families and get help to choose the best high school, the best courses, the best colleges, scholarships, and can count on support well beyond high school. This program would not exist without Rosemary's initiative, determination, patience, creativity, hard work, generosity, and rallying of her network, including the U of M School of Social Work. One young woman, I'll call Kimberly, has been at AFG since elementary school. She's starting her second year at U of M, pursuing a degree in psychology. She's been living on campus and adapting to life away from her family and community, initially way outside of her comfort zone. Kimberly is the first in her family to go to college, setting a high standard for her two younger sisters and all the others in our program. She achieved a 4-point high school GPA and was able to choose from 9 college acceptances. This past summer, she led a college tour on U of M's campus for younger AFG girls. Really cool. Fulfilling Rosemary's vision, her tuition and expenses are covered by scholarships and grants, along with her savings and $1,000 per semester from her family, 0 loans. It was really wonderful just 4 months ago to update Rosemary regarding the school success and college destinations of our participants. Kimberly is not the only one here at U of M. Nearly all graduate and they choose challenging academic paths. Rosemary was a social worker extraordinaire. She was fearless, or more accurately, would walk into scary situations and do scary things despite any fear. She did so multiple times, confident in her purpose. There are many such stories. She was working with a Detroit mother who was unable to regain custody of her young son because she was living in a crack house with no other place to go, although she wasn't using herself. Rosemary sought her out in the crack house to help her find solutions for herself and her son. The crack house dwellers were a bit taken aback, although perhaps not as much as her family members, who later learned of this incident with horror. Why did Rosemary go there? Simple. That's where the woman was who needed support. Another of my favorite stories was way back when Rosemary was a young social worker working in a settlement house type community center. She and her coworkers had an understanding that given the high level of violent crime and other neighborhood conditions, they would never leave just one staff member alone in the building. One day, however, wires got crossed, and at closing time, Rosemary found herself alone in the building with 3 young men. She became a little nervous when she observed the young men huddling in a corner and speaking in whispers. Her gut told her that something was up. She approached them, confessed that she was a little uneasy about walking to the bus stop alone, as it was dark and, there was some crime in the neighborhood. And sure that they would rise to the occasion, she asked them to escort her to help keep her safe. They did. Her high expectations of others, including her mentees, her students, but also girls in our program, youth in the juvenile justice system, women in the correctional system, drove all of us to aim high. She called out the best in us. Rosemary advised me when I graduated to create something that is needed and doesn't already exist, to do something hard. She did this every day of her adult life. I'm so honored to be able to speak about Rosemary on behalf of all who've had the privilege of learning from her and being her friend. She was also superb and equally passionate in other roles as a spouse, mother, grandmother, sister, as a host, football fan, gardener, and neighbor. I will continue to be inspired and challenged by her powerful example and her vision. All who knew her know that her positive impact was tremendous and is forever. Thousands, including many who've never met her, have been lifted up by her work, her example, her courage. Now that all of you know her story, all of you are able to share in that legacy and magnify her impact. Rosemary remains present in us. Thanks.
Amy, thank you so much for lifting up these incredible accomplishments of Rosemary, who, as you describe her, as a social work extraordinaire. And I think you did justice to that title in that beautiful tribute. I know that your testimonial is just one example of how Rosemary's scholarship and dedication inspired generations of Michigan social workers, and that there are many other such stories. Now, we are going to turn our attention to today's program, and I want to welcome you all and to thank you for joining us. The Fedele F and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Lecture on Child Welfare was established in 1985 through gifts from alumni, faculty, friends, and members of the Fauri family. And I want to especially thank the Fauri family for their continued engagement with the school. This lecture is presented annually in recognition of former dean of the school and later vice president of the university, Fedele F. Fauri, and his wife, Iris M. Fauri. Much of the current social welfare legislation at both the state and federal levels is the product of Dean Fauri's efforts. After his career at the university, Fauri was the director of the Michigan Department of Social Services. He then moved to Washington, D.C., where he held numerous leadership positions. And these include, and I'm about to give you a long list of job titles that demonstrate Fauri's impact and influence: Senior Specialist in Social Security for the U.S. Senate, Social Security Advisor for both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, Social Security Advisor to President Kennedy, and Chair of the Advisory Council on Public Welfare for the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This lecture series, named in his honor, is intended to serve as a forum for the discussion of ideas and proposals to enhance the well-being of young people. And so that's where we'll be going today. And so it's my pleasure to hand the podium over, so to speak, to Associate Professor Katie McGuire-Jack, who will give a brief overview of this year's lecture and introduce our speakers. Katie's research focuses on child abuse and neglect prevention with an emphasis on communities and geographic disparities. She has expertise in advanced statistical methods and program evaluation. Her work is funded by the United States Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, and the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, as well as the Ohio Children's Trust Fund. Therefore, I will introduce Katie.
Thank you so much, Dean Angel. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished speakers today for our talk on child trafficking and child safety. So if we could go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thank you. So first up, we have a leading national expert in child trafficking, Dr. Jacqueline Michelomaya, who is an associate professor in the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University. She is the author and co-author of numerous publications, presentations, and trainings on human trafficking, human rights, social justice, and leadership at the university, local, national, and international levels. Her last co-authored press book is entitled The Cause and Consequence of Human Trafficking, Human Rights Violations. She is the 2019 recipient of the Influential Scholar Award by the International Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference Award Committee. She has held a number of leadership positions that include serving as the Associate Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at The Ohio State University, Director of Leadership Initiatives for Women of Color, the Master of Social Work Program Director in the College of Social Work, and the Undergraduate Program Director in the College of Social Work. We are very pleased to have Jacqueline here with us today. Next up, we have Dr. Ashley Heiligman, who is a licensed social worker with a Bachelor and Master of Social Work specializing in direct practice with children and families. Ashley has 16 years of child welfare experience in both the United States and abroad. She is the executive director of Global Child Advocates, which is a team of child protection specialists working to resolve the root causes of child trafficking and orphanhood. Ashley also serves on the advisory network for Faith to Action Initiative. In 2017, she co-founded GCA's social enterprise Sojourn Studio, which provides dignified work and a community of support for marginalized women in Thailand. And then our third speaker for today is Dr. Celia Williamson, who has been engaged in anti-human trafficking work for over 29 years. She has published numerous articles on the subject and has delivered over 200 presentations at various conferences and events. She founded the first anti-trafficking program in Ohio in 1993 and worked directly with victims in Toledo for several years. She has completed numerous federally funded studies, written several articles and reports, wrote 4 books on sex trafficking, and completed a memoir of her experiences as an anti-trafficking advocate. Additional accomplishments include founding the annual International Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference, founding the Lucas County Human Trafficking Coalition, and serving as president of the Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars. In 2015, she became the director of Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo to further the mission of combating human trafficking through research, education, and engagement. She teaches social work practice and human trafficking courses, and in her spare time, produces a podcast called the Emancipation Nation Podcast and founded an online community called the Emancipation Nation Network. So those are our 3 speakers for today. Really excited to have them. And then we have our own wonderful Dr. Robert Ortega, who will be helping us with the discussion section. His research interests are in the areas of relationship development, group work practice, treatment interventions, and service utilization, particularly in the areas of mental health and child welfare. Dr. Ortega has presented and written on these topics with a special focus on diversity and social justice in research and practice. He has published in the areas of mutual aid, multicultural issues and group work, child welfare, permanency planning, family preservation, and culturally responsive child welfare practice. He is the principal investigator on the first national study of Latinos in child welfare, and he has expertise in both qualitative and quantitative research methods and is currently working on projects to increase the pipeline for graduates from underrepresented groups into research scientist professions. Thank you. And now I will hand it over to our first speaker to get us started on our child trafficking and child safety presentation, Dr. Jacqueline Mishlamaya.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Katie. And I thank the Dean of the School of Social Work and my colleagues for having me here today to talk about a really important topic, global and domestic child trafficking, a challenge for child welfare workers. So I'm really thankful that all of you are attending this particular lecture series. And I believe that you're going to learn quite a bit because there's so much to learn about child trafficking. So I'm going to spend 20 minutes with you talking about this topic. And let me just say, by the end of the conversation, you should understand the dynamics underlying child trafficking, local and globally, how and where it occurs, who is most vulnerable, and become familiar with the conditions that place victims at risk. And also by the end of today, you should start to formulate new perspectives on child welfare and child safety. So let me just start out with my positionality, the lens in which I do this work. As a scholar activist and a 3-time 3-degree social work individual, I intend to exhaust my privilege every time I'm given an opportunity to amplify the voices of those who have been silenced. I believe this work requires one to be courageous, bold, and critical, even of one's beloved profession. I'm of the belief that there is nothing normal or right about violence against children. I feel that human trafficking in general and child trafficking is reprehensible and a human rights violation. And child trafficking thrives in this country and this world because we as a society, as a people, have relegated the lived experiences of impoverished and marginalized people to the peripheral. And then last, I believe that all policies, processes, and practices, including people we put in positions around anti-trafficking, must be done in concert with those with lived experiences as exploited and trafficked persons. They are truly the experts here. And I've heard many of them tell me over the decades, nothing about us without us. And I definitely understand where they're coming from. So let me tell you about my experience in terms of how I got to where I am today. And all of this started in 1996 when I met the first person who was trafficked. She called herself a child prostitute, but after she told her story to the group of us, I knew that was not child prostitution, that was something else, and I didn't know what it was called back in the 90s. We hadn't quite used the term human trafficking yet. But I decided at that point in my career that I was going to travel around the United States and I was going to travel around the world to get an understanding of how it is possible that a 16-year-old Black girl in the States could be trafficked, forced to have sex with dogs, and identify as a child prostitute without anyone intervening. And so I've committed my career to traveling the world to understand human trafficking. And I've traveled to a number of countries, but these 7 countries in particular, including the United States, has taught me something. It has taught me that humans have a collective capacity to dehumanize others. And when we do that, you can do anything to someone. And if you follow the scholarship around genocide, this is one of the stages of genocide, is that you dehumanize and you objectify people. You call them vermin, savages, snakes, dogs, and cockroaches. And then they were capable of doing anything to them. And these 7 countries are not the exception. This is the norm. This happens all around the world. But in these 7 countries in particular, I was able to talk to trafficked people, talk to relatives and friends of trafficked people. I was able to be in venues where trafficking was taking place, and I actually saw it for myself with my own eyes. And this is a travesty. And so my words to you most urgently is, the time is now. We must be willing to confront systems and algorithms of oppression that make conditions right for human trafficking. And I would love for you all to take time after this presentation to challenge me on my algorithms of oppression. Just go to Google and type in the word sexy Black woman, type in farmers, type in illegals, and you'll be stunned at the type of images that we're pounded with daily in terms of contributing to oppression of groups of people. So let's talk globally before I talk domestically then. So look at this map, this trans-regional flow map. You can see that trafficking has happened all around the world, sometimes within borders, sometimes across borders. But one thing that's very clear in this map is that the North America, Canada, and the United States is a destination continent. People from all around the world are being trafficked to the United States, and that's why it's such a huge problem in this country. If you look at online trafficking from the Department of Justice, this data, you can see that the United States is a very hot spot for online trafficking activities. And that's why it is possible for someone to be in Bangladesh and to be trafficked right here in the United States because of the online uptick of trafficking activities. So let's look at income ranks. The United States is considered to be a high income country, whereas all of Africa, the entire continent, is considered to be composed of low income countries. As you look at this figure, you can see as we go from high income countries to low income countries, the number of children, those less than 18 years of age, increased drastically from 14% to 50% as indicated by the brown colors in the figures there. So the income rank matters. And I'll talk to you more about concentration and poverty momentarily. Children, 33% of global trafficking victims are children around the world in various forms of sex and labor trafficking and other forms of trafficking. But let's look at these pre-existing factors. What are traffickers capitalizing on to their advantage? And of course, economic need is at 51%. And you see in the diagrams there are a number of other pre-existing factors that make people vulnerable, especially children, to being trafficked, including a disability, that's a physical disability, being deprived of parental care, immigration status. And you'll see these at-risk variables momentarily yet again, things that make people vulnerable to being trafficked. Let's look domestically right here in the United States of America. Are you aware that in all 50 states of this country, trafficking among children has been detected? All 50 states. And it's not because we were just so wonderful at identifying these individuals because we saw their need. It was because they were arrested. And that is often a first course of action for trafficked children. They're being arrested versus being rescued or assisted or helped to exit commercialized sex or labor points. So let me just quickly revisit the language around, the legal language around who's trafficked. There's labor trafficking in terms of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And then there's sex trafficking. And this seems to be the form we focus a lot on here in the States because it is very noticeable in terms of those who are seeking to understand it and look for it. In terms I want to focus on really are those that are retained for minors, those less than 18 years of age, at least according to the federal definition. You may see the word DMST, CSEC, you may hear the term survival sex, especially around two-spirit LGBTQ individuals, sex trafficking of minors, and child trafficking. So you'll see these words and terms used interchangeably describing sex trafficking. Let's look at some data from 2015 about the perceived prevalence of sex trafficking of juveniles based on law enforcement officers, who are oftentimes the first point of contact. And you can see the two main areas in terms of widespread percentages fall right into that online sex advertisement I just showed you about, online trafficking, and then being in the street. Oftentimes they're arrested as what some would call wrongly child prostitutes. But these are the two main venues for sex trafficking in the States. And then labor trafficking, where you'll find children, agriculture, restaurants, beauty and health services, domestic servitude, peddling, begging rings, travel sales crew, and even transporting drugs. So all kids that we see transporting drugs may not be doing it on their own volition. So the pandemic, we all know it was horrible. It was even worse for children who were trafficked. Let's look at some data from Polaris, from the hotline, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, about known recruitment relationships. In case you are not aware, sometimes family members, actual family members, traffic their own children. So in the case of the data from between 2019 and 2020, it shows that family members, caregivers increased from 21% to 31% in trafficking minors. During this same time period, intimate partners, these individuals that some girls and boys call their partners, lovers, boyfriends, significant others, increased from 22% to 27%. And I'll talk to you about that grooming momentarily and how these individuals sometimes think these are their boyfriends or their man or husbands or wives. We'll talk about that. And so my first question before I move on, though, for you all here, do you think it's important for child welfare workers to understand federal and state laws beyond mandating reported laws? What do you think about social workers and child welfare workers needing to understand laws beyond mandated reporting laws that I know we're all familiar with? And I'll give you a few seconds to enter yes or no. And I know that social workers and child welfare workers are saying, we can't do it all. We can't do it all. And I understand you can't do it all, but I am curious as to what you think about understanding federal and state laws. Wonderful, I'm so relieved. Thank you. I see 98% there. I'm so relieved. And so my response is, okay, it's not working here. Let me go down. Okay, my response is yes. I say yes, because it is a missed opportunity for all of us to intervene on behalf of children, our clients, when we do not understand or know the laws that are designed to protect them and to assist them. I think it is really important that we do understand those laws. And let me give you a visual representation of how human trafficking is even possible. Look at this ship in the middle of an ocean, completely exposed, alone, and vulnerable. And this is the strongest picture I could find to give you a sense of how visceral it is and what condition a person could be in that gets them in a predicament, or that they're lured into a predicament where they are being trafficked, especially children. And so when I think about human trafficked persons, I think about vulnerable populations of people persisting under precarious and dire circumstances. And so let's talk about, well, who's being trafficked. Well, I want you to think in an intersecting type of way when you think about sex and labor trafficking, and think of it as an accumulation of vulnerabilities and at-risk factors, along with intersecting identities. And so here's a list based on the scholarship of my colleagues and myself about who gets trafficked disproportionately when it comes to children. I would say racially minoritized children, and who are impoverished, and who are involved in child serving agencies, lack positive educational experiences, runaway homeless, gang membership or affiliation, unaccompanied, identify with the two-spirit LGBTQIA+ communities, and most unfortunate, those who fall prey to cunning friends, in quotes, relatives or romantic partners who develop their trust. So all these things are interacting with one another. And this is similar to labor trafficking. It's an accumulation of at-risk factors, making people vulnerable. Again, disproportionately, those who are unaccompanied, disabilities, undocumented, unstable immigration status, marginalized communities, recent migration or relocation. So you can see how this is starting to look, how these intersections are starting to play out in a very unfortunate way. And based on the data from the hotline in terms of calls coming in, these particular risk factors line up with what is actually happening based on the calls coming in around substance use, physical health concern, housing issues, recent migration. And so this confirms of who and what populations are the most vulnerable. So how does this work? How are these vulnerabilities and risk factors weaponized against children? Often. It's the best way I can say it, often. Oftentimes, these children are lured in by these promises, something they want or need: relationships, love, food, housing, money, drugs, jobs, some unmet need. And these children are groomed. They don't have to be taken, they're groomed. They develop trust between themselves and the perpetrator. And they willingly go into the care, unfortunately, of these cunning individuals. So how is this possible globally and domestically then? Let's talk about that. I see it as this huge cosm of some type, macrocosm in terms of what makes child trafficking possible. I see colorism, nativism, caste systems, colonialization, and they're filtered through all these systems on top. There are the push factors. They result in corruption, low skill levels, and displacement. And then there's the pull factors. There's got to be something better than this. And they believe in these false promises, believe in a good life elsewhere. And one really important one to look at is the diaspora communities. They know someone from their village, their communities, their cities, their home. They have gone somewhere and things are better now. So they think. Domestically, how has this happened? Again, layers and layers interacting: racism, sexism, classism, capitalism, all filtered through these systems. Then you have the outcomes over there under the green box. Then you have the adverse childhood experiences. All of these things are interacting to make trafficking in the United States and abroad possible. So child welfare and child safety. We should all look out the window and just think and pause about what can we do differently. So in terms of child welfare, many of us have seen these children in our care and probably were not even aware of it. And so according to O'Brien and colleagues, Between 20% to 85% of sexually exploited children in 3 different samples had child welfare involvement. So just quickly, what do the research say about child trafficking and child welfare? Well, O'Brien and colleagues found that when it comes to child welfare involved youth, they're more likely to run away from group home and foster care and have substance misuse issues. Johnson found when they looked at 8 case records that youth need to maintain their agency even when under our care. Finnegan and colleagues found that when it comes to testing this traumagenic social ecological framework, that we must look at child trafficking from the lens of the child in their personal, community, and societal levels as shown in my other diagrams. Swartz decided, like her colleague, Swartz and colleagues says that we need to focus on prevention. And when it comes to McDonald and Middleton, they encourage us all to adjust and to engage in trauma-informed perspectives and pay attention to Maslow's basic needs of humans as we proceed in our work. So, as a profession, are we willing to dismantle systems of oppression, give up some power, and allow children in our care to maintain their agency, to engage in that difficult, sometimes uncomfortable racialized work, respect and value the epistemic authority and wisdom of vulnerable and at-risk adolescents in our care? Are we willing to innovate around robust systems of care and to creatively develop services before the child is embedded in its revolving door of services, care, and surveillance? And to remember that one person can make a difference in a child's and a family's life. So, are we going to move the needle? Are we going to pause as a profession, interrogate, disrupt, and innovate? Or is it going to be business as usual? You know, one of our colleagues said back in 2008, thousands of professionals do their best to help struggling parents and vulnerable children. The system saves lives and futures. The child protection system is far from perfect, but at the same time, much has been accomplished. And I would agree with my colleagues, especially back then in 2008. But now we're at a different time in 2022. Change is inevitable. We have to do things differently so that we truly meet the needs of trafficked children in this country. So my one last question to you all is, in your opinion, is child welfare doing enough to fight child trafficking? In your humble opinion, is child welfare doing enough? Is child welfare doing enough around child trafficking? Woo, I'm relieved. Yes, again. Wonderful. I'm going to go with the majority here, 99%. I agree with you 100%. One second. It takes a moment to get my screen back after the polls. 1 second here. I say not yet, not yet. And I say this because child welfare is in its infancy stage of addressing child trafficking when it comes to understanding it, screening, prevention, and interventions, as well as around creating policies, procedures, and practices, including, again, putting people in positions that comprehensively and inclusively address child trafficking. But I want to say this with the caveat, in all fairness, this entire country is not ready. It's not prepared. It is still in its infancy, 22 years after the TVPA and 22 years after the United Nations officially came up with a statement as well around the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. So none of us are there just yet. And so my last slide to you is this. A colleague said this to me in the 90s, and I never forgot how serious and how impassioned she was when she said this to me. She said, social work is serious business. We are dealing with people's lives. I take this very seriously, and I never forgot that. And so I say to my colleagues on the call here, as social workers, it is critical that we're not co-opted and that we reject any temptation to say that understanding child trafficking It's outside the purview of the scope of our work. I know we cannot do it all, but this is one important thing for us all to do. And so I say we are all responsible for caring after children, including trafficked children. Thank you all so very much for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Hello, I am Ashley Heiligman with Global Child Advocates, and I am so honored and privileged. I feel so privileged to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I love speaking with social workers because this is such a huge need globally. And so I'm hopeful that I can share some new information for you today that will be helpful in the work that you do. So I'm going to dive right in. These are some numbers you might have already heard. So human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. So it's huge. It's the fastest growing realm of criminality around the world, and it's impacting an estimated 24.9 million victims globally on any given day. And these are stats that are more common that you might have heard, but I'm hoping that throughout this conversation that you'll be able to hear some information that maybe is not as common. One of the things that, move this thing, sorry, there we go. One of the things that, sorry, I think my stuff is in the way. I'm so sorry. Okay, one of the things that is less well known or that we're less aware of or we don't talk about as much is just the number of trafficking victims that are actually identified every year. So less than, according to the Trafficking in Persons report that's done by the Department of State, less than 1% of trafficking victims are identified every year. So this, you can see the chart that it is increasing, that we're able to identify the number more than we used to, but it is still just a tiny fraction of the victims that are actually at large. So in 2021, there were 90,354 victims that were identified, and that doesn't mean rescued or rehabilitated, but that they were identified is 0.3%. 0.3% of the 24.9 million. And so what this tells us is the importance of prevention. There's also a great international need to increase the social service workforce to implement the national strategies that a lot of countries have already put into place. Quite often implementation is where there is such huge breakdown, but it also points to prevention being key. I want to talk a little bit about the high risk factors for child trafficking, and so much of it is very in line with what the last presentation shared. Living in conflict zones under complicit governments, where governments are party to what is happening to children and they don't make changes. For example, these are the countries that have been identified as having state-sponsored trafficking in persons, and this is in the form of primarily child labor and child soldiers. In our work in Myanmar, we have found that it's become a major issue where children are being recruited from children's homes or from communities into the military to serve as child soldiers. And the response that's needed for this kind of situation is very different than the one that I'm going to speak to today, but it would be an entirely different presentation. The second is the high ACE scores and early childhood trauma, as was spoken to by the previous presenter. One of the things that is not spoken about as much is just the prevalence that we're seeing in research that victims of sex trafficking and human traffickers are often victims of childhood trauma. Quite often it's easy to demonize the traffickers, but they quite often in the research have also experienced significant trauma in their own childhoods. And we see this as social workers, we understand this because the factors that would cause someone to be incredibly vulnerable to trafficking can also lead someone to the point of exploiting other people and having a lack of empathy or understanding for their needs, or the lack of understanding how love should look and how it feels, or the lack of the ability to feel the feelings of others. This is some of the research that we found that is related to survivors of sex trafficking. So 85 to 89% have a history of child sexual abuse. In some studies, 40 to 75 have a history of sexual abuse, the previous being child abuse and neglect, but then also of convicted traffickers, that 88% experience physical abuse while growing up, and another 76% experience child sexual assault. And so this is really important for us as social workers to be able to recognize the need for for strong intervention at an early age, that we're able to help victims move past that so they do not take that into adulthood, into damaging behaviors. The last factor that I want to talk about probably the most is the growing up in an institution or outside of a safe family. This is one that was alluded to from the domestic side in the last presentation, and some of the numbers are here up on the screen, where National Foster Youth Institute recently estimated that 60% of child sex trafficking victims have been in foster care, upwards of 89% in some studies our victims have had child welfare involvement. And you can see the numbers here of where we have strong evidence of where there's a link between children that grow up without a family or outside of a safe family and that are then trafficked. But one of the things that we have less information on that we don't speak about as much is the linkages between trafficking and institutions globally. What we have found in my work internationally in the international space in many countries is that children are being trafficked into children's homes and orphanages. This comes through the form of recruitment, where traffickers might go to a poor community where they tell families that they might provide 3 meals a day or they will care for their children, but actually the children end up being exploited within the children's home to beg for money, and sometimes being even exploited outside of the children's home, which is the next point, that children are being trafficked out of institutions. So because of the vulnerabilities of not having belonging, not having attachment, we see where children's homes will allow the children in the home to be trafficked. We were just in Tanzania where there was a situation where we were speaking with someone with the Department of State, and they spoke about the investigations of Westerners that have moved into communities, have begun supporting orphanages so that they have access then to children, and that children are being exploited. And in those situations, it's extremely difficult to verify because the orphanages don't want to lose funding. At the same time, we also see that care leavers are very vulnerable to trafficking. So in many countries, children that leave at age 18, many children are forced to leave the premises of an institution or an orphanage. And this is very difficult because they have grown up without any attachment or a strong sense of belonging or who they are or identity. And so they're moved into communities where they don't have connection and they don't have a foundation from which to thrive. This makes them highly vulnerable to the target or to traffickers to target. We also then see that often in the criminal justice system that children have been trafficked back into, children who have been trafficked are placed back into orphanages. And quite often they can be experience abuse there, and also can have just negative outcomes for the rest of their adulthood. One of the key informants in this recent study that was put out showing this link shared this: orphans are being profiled where the system allows it. Traffickers know where to go. Orphanages, care homes are like holding pens for victims of trafficking. It's part of the methodology. The great news is that one of the things that is less well known is that the majority of children in children's homes around the world actually have a living parent. This graphic shows some of the statistics around the world that research has shown us that sort of dispels the orphan myth. So in places like Ghana, 90% of children that are in orphanages or shelters or safe houses actually have a living parent. Same in Indonesia, where you see 94%, and Sri Lanka, 94%. And quite often these are children that are there because of colonialization and because of poverty, where people have come in and they have offered children in poverty education and 3 meals a day through an orphanage. But the efforts to protect children from poor communities is actually increasing their vulnerabilities exponentially because of all of the reasons I just shared, where children in children's homes are forgotten in the same way that we see the correlation with foster youth here in the States. So what is needed? What are the solutions? From our perspective, what we have found to be the best prevention and the best intervention is community-based intervention. There's a great need to strengthen the social service workforce to reunify families and to implement local child protections with protocols to prevent family separation in these communities. We've seen it be incredibly successful to educate the at-risk communities about human trafficking and empower families to protect children. We also need to support children who are victims of trafficking in returning to safe family members or to an alternative family, and provide appropriate victim-centered, trauma-informed mental health services, and psychological assistance to these survivors. The solution is relationally based in communities, in families, because we believe that children are best protected within that environment. I share this picture because this isn't the kind of image that we normally see within the anti-trafficking space, but this is one of our social workers who is sitting around in a community with women, and she's about to teach about anti-trafficking work in that community, but she's built relationship. And this is what's needed around the world, even though it might seem small and insignificant considering the global need. This is where change starts. And this is where children can be best protected, is within the communities in which they were born, where they have identity and belonging and connection. These communities, children don't need to be pulled out of these communities, but these communities can be made strong and safe places for children to thrive. Thank you very much. The poll has just been put up. So simple answers, but where is a child best protected from trafficking? An orphanage, a safe family, or foster care?
We'll go ahead and make our transition now to Celia Williamson while you're all responding to that poll. Thank you so much, Ashley. Give you all just a few more seconds while we adjust to our next presenter. All right, and here are the results to that poll. If you want to respond to them, Ashley, feel free to unmute.
That's great. It seems like you guys got it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Dr. Williamson, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think the previous two presentations were amazing and very informative. And if I had 10 minutes to talk about the issue, then, what would I say? And I'm trying to advance my slide. Oh, I would say that practically speaking in the US, something is missing from our micro to our macro work. And I'm having a hard time advancing this slide. So I have a couple of facts that I just want to throw at you. One of them is that sex trafficking is less about snatching and kidnapping young people, and it's more about manipulation. So it's not white vans driving around typically snatching people and chaining their wrists and their ankles. It's more about chaining your mind and your heart. It's more about manipulation. So we have some macro level misguided overall understanding about how recruitment actually works. We have a misguided rhetoric going on in the country, and it's repeating the mantra that anybody can be trafficked, anybody can be trafficked. And as you heard, the two presenters previously talk about specific populations at risk, at high risk, because saying anybody can be trafficked assumes that everyone's at equal risk. Everybody's not at equal risk. And so it's very important that we don't continue this mantra, because what happens is we actually facilitate institutionalized privilege. So when we say anybody can be trafficked, then we have people with power, money, and influence running to their communities to protect them first, away from those communities that need them most. So kids in poverty, LGBTQ community, kids with disabilities, kids who are foreign born, people of color, those are the populations at high risk. And then those kids of any ethnic background that have been system involved in child welfare, juvenile court, homeless, runaway, those are the kids at high risk. So we've got to stop saying anybody can be trafficked. Technically they can, but they're all not at equal risk. Human trafficking is less about rescue and restore. We have a national rescue and restore campaign going on where we're asking law enforcement to rescue and social workers and people like that to restore. But it's more in the long term about human rights for people. We have to understand that victims suffer trauma, and trauma negatively affects your feeling, your thinking, your behavior. Trauma sits and then it permeates and it poisons every aspect of a human being. We have to deal with the internal trauma, the complex trauma, the chronic trauma that's happening. So we as social workers tend to connect people to these external, we make these external linkages, and those are important. Housing and legal services and substance abuse treatment and food and clothing and medical service, and all these things are critical. And we walk alongside our survivors with respect and dignity and a non-judgmental attitude and unconditional positive regard. And let's say we do all of that, we do it wonderfully. It won't heal the internal trauma. Somehow we think that magically through osmosis, that these external linkages to housing and resources are somehow going to heal something that's internally have been traumatized and is affecting every aspect of their life. And then we're confused when that recovery, that healing doesn't come about. So there are 3 T's of trauma, and we like to talk a lot about trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed care is so important because it talks about safety. Clients have to always feel safe and a mutuality and a collaboration and a respect, and in your policies and your engagement and your communication, we should always be wearing our trauma glasses so that we see clients that have experienced trauma. We can understand that the way they're behaving or the way they're feeling could be a trauma response. We have to know that, but we also have to know that trauma-informed care will not heal trauma. Trauma-informed care helps us, the practitioner, not to harm the client, not to re-trigger the client, not to hurt the client. But that's a low standard of care. Just, I'm a professional, you're paying me not to hurt my client. That's not, that's not quality. That should be done because it's the best practice, but it will not heal trauma. It just helps you not to harm the client or re-injure the client. And so trauma treatment, and this is where we sometimes get confused when we're talking trauma treatment, is very different. That's when you go to a trauma-trained certified therapist who's using a treatment modality that is focused on healing trauma. And when we just send our client, our survivor, out to counseling, yeah, you just go to therapy because therapy is just therapy. No, it's not. And so they go to 8 sessions of counseling and they say, well, counseling doesn't work for me. And so what we intended to do was not injure our client, but what we did is we harmed our client because now our client is saying, well, counseling doesn't work for me. It's not because counseling doesn't work, it's because they didn't go to the right therapist who is using a particular modality, who is trained, who is certified. Then we have trauma-focused long-term care. That means the case manager, the therapist, everybody is working on healing the trauma, not just not hurting the client, but actually using methods and practices that help heal the trauma. That's critically important. No more magical thinking. No more thinking that we're going to link people to houses and legal services and through the power of our relationship, somehow they're going to internally heal from their trauma. The other thing I'll say is labels are important, right? So let's say our client gets to the criminal justice system and they want justice, and by, against the odds, they see justice and that person is incarcerated and, good for them. And then that system tells them that they have closure. You have closure now. So you go home and you sit on the couch and you say, man, I have closure. That's great. But you feel very broken inside. You still aren't healed. And what does closure mean anyway? Am I supposed to close it, lock it away, stuff it down? Is that what I'm supposed to do now just because somebody went to jail? The other label we say is survivor. You're a survivor, as if, I'm a survivor, but I still have trauma, and we want to move victims to survivor to thriver. to thriver. Survivor, no, because if I asked you how you're doing and you say I'm surviving, that's not living. That's not thriving in life. So we want to move from victim to survivor to thriver. So what have we learned? We've learned that trauma poisons someone's feeling, thinking, and behavior. Trauma steals joy. Trauma robs people of a fulfilling life. It poisons healthy relationships. Lesson 2, trauma-informed care is necessary, but will not heal trauma. We learned that linking survivors to external services is great, but not enough. We learned that trauma recovery is needed, and it's an internal journey, and it takes a long time. So if you want to know more about human trafficking, I also have a podcast called Emancipation Nation. We bring on experts all across the country and around the world, and we dig deep into how anti-trafficking advocates can do this work and do it most effectively. And so this is my poll question, like, trauma-informed care heals trauma, true or false? So you can answer that. Okay. And if we can see the results, but that's all I wanted to say. So thank you so much for your time. Absolutely, 80% should be 100%, but because trauma-informed care doesn't heal trauma, it just helps us not to harm our clients. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you very much. This is Robert Ortega. Listen, I wanted to just see if we could have maybe a little reflection. We have a little bit of time here to think about maybe what you've heard from each other. There are some questions that we can get to, unless you want to start out with just general thoughts and reflections on what you've heard. Jacqueline, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure. You know, as I was listening to Ashley talk, I'll start with her. She mentioned about the presence of families, parents being alive, and that was the exact experience I had abroad. When you're talking about low-income countries, there are times where families would put their children in what they call orphanage or children's home with the expectation they would come back and get those children at some point, only to be found they're sold on the black market. So that is very prevalent. So thank you for bringing that up. And then Dr. Williamson, you mentioned the whole trauma, getting this right. I love the distinction, because when you think about trafficking and you think about social workers, of course, we're supposed to do no harm. What else are we supposed to do when it comes to our clients? And I love that you brought that piece up. Thank you so much.
Ashley, did you have any reflections?
Yes, I feel like I learned a lot in both of these presentations. And so I'm so grateful. It seems like, I know that Celia has done so many presentations and explained so much of this. So I feel like that's a really important takeaway, that's the one thing of all of your vast knowledge of all the things that you have taught on, have experienced, all of the wealth of information that you have, that missing piece is that most important thing for us to know as social workers, of how we approach it is so important. And it's critical that we're doing this well, because we're probably going to be doing it the best of anyone else in the system. And so I think that's really a great point. And then Dr. Meshelmaya, I hope I said that right. I loved your presentation, and I think your experience abroad, and just the fact that so much of that correlates with what I've experienced, with what we've seen. It's something that I don't think is as well known. And so I love that you brought in all of those different factors that were part of what makes kids vulnerable. And then I love that graphic of the full spectrum of everything that's affecting children, from culturism to colonialism. I love that.
Celia, we have one, there's at least one question I wanted to ask from the board, the questionnaires, but do you have any other reflections?
No, I think these are two amazing women. I'm so glad that University of Michigan does this work every year. And I was wondering how Jacqueline was going to pull this off in 20 minutes, and she did it. And she did it comprehensively, clearly. And Ashley, the global perspective you brought, amazing. I also learned. So thank you so much.
So the question in the question of the Q&As is, how can we help human service providers recognize human trafficking victims as part of their standard intake process?
Yeah, we at the University of Toledo, we actually have a valid assessment tool for youth 12 to 17, and we'd be happy to share it for free. So it's just one of the tools, but there are many, many tools in the US. That's what I would contribute. And yeah.
And I would love to add too, just in terms of helping child welfare providers detect it in children, because as I told you about the example from 1996, when the woman identified as a child prostitute, that is oftentimes the case. Individuals do not self-identify as being trafficked. And I know that when I was at a group home about 10 years ago, working with children and youth in the system, and what I would often ask is, if I saw something or suspected something was not right, I will ask about that friend. Who was that friend? How did you become friends with so-and-so? And how old is that friend? And why is that friend buying you those things? Because what are you giving in return? I often ask about that. And most times I find that, especially the young ladies, they assumed it was a mutual relationship. I had to talk to them then about relationships. So asking questions, being curious more than anything else is what has worked for me.
I agree.
There's there's like several questions that they all kind of center around like, so what is going on that's working? Like, why are we still having these and raising these concerns right now? Is there anything going on within various places, systems, locations? And then the other one is, and what can we as social workers do? Anybody?
I think there are lots of great things going on. There are people all across the country and all across the world doing great work. Unfortunately, the traffickers are always ahead of us. They're 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of us. So the moment we can get a handle on how to be more preventive, how to intervene, they've gone on to a new way to traffic individuals. So there's this program here in Columbus where it's a safe haven. And part of the safe haven, there's a collaboration with several NGOs. So to keep their children out of the care of child welfare, they have this agreement where they'll take on the children for a period of time while the woman is in the safe haven getting what she needs to get well. And I know this model is being used in other places, but it's one model to help the mom be at a place of peace, knowing that her child is not in foster care or group home or at risk for being adopted out. Because this is what some of the women say, I just need something to hold on. And for me, it is that child. So I know.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of, I agree, there are lots of things going on. We have, in Ohio, where I am, we have 21 anti-trafficking coalitions. So, and they are all busy. The issue is not that things aren't happening. The issue now is, what is best practice? What is evidence-based? What is the most effective? Because we don't, when we go to the doctor with our elbow that's hurt, we don't want the doctor just doing something, checking our knee. We want the best. So the issue right now is there's a lot of busy work all across the US and around the world, but is it effective? 9 times out of 10, they cannot tell you if that is effective. They can tell you how they feel about it, what their gut tells them, but do they have evidence to say? And this is where our practice needs to move to evidence-based practice.
I can share just from from sort of the perspective that I presented on. globally, there's a massive movement towards deinstitutionalization of children. And in some places that's being done well, and in some places it's not. And in some places it's being only pushed by the government, but when there's CSO or NGO collaboration, it can be done really well. So we've seen that in places like Kenya. We've seen that in, oh gosh, what was that other example? In Nepal, they're working together really well with the government. And in Sri Lanka right now, we're working with the government because they've recognized that even amidst this financial crisis, that there is the propensity towards mass institutionalization again, where families are coming to children's homes saying, I can't protect my child. And that just puts children at exponential risk long-term for trafficking. At the same time, you have traffickers offering a warm bed, safe 3 meals a day, so that those families will think that they are a safe place. So there's a lot of people working on it. And then on a community level, I saw the question about with families, and I think is similar to what you're talking about. We use a framework called Strengthening Families Protective Factors Framework. And it's a holistic approach to really coming around families with concrete support, with helping them build parental resilience. There's 5 really areas where we come around families, and it is an evidence-informed approach, but it's a way of keeping kids in communities and making those communities safer.
It's all great. I mean, there's one other important reminder, at least to me, that not everybody who's here, we have over 220 people who are listening or, here. And some of them aren't social workers. So the question is, so what would somebody who's not sort of in a professional role, like, social workers, what can they do to be more involved and to contribute?
Well, in Michigan, there is a state level commission, but there are several anti-trafficking coalitions in Michigan as well. Ohio, like I said, has 21. I would say get involved in one of the coalitions. First of all, there's, educate yourself. There's PolarisProject.org and Shared Hope International, or sharedhope.org. Those are 2 very credible sites. I would be careful just getting on typing human trafficking, because you will get all kinds of nonsense. So those are 2 credible sites. And then getting involved in your coalition, coming to the table. A smart coalition knows that there is lots of talent coming to the table. So what do they have to provide us? And they will use your talents and skills to get involved in the issue. So it doesn't matter what the skill is, who you are, you have something rich to offer an anti-trafficking coalition. That's what I would say.
I think we might have time for one more. So there is, some of the discussion you talked about had to do with, strengthening families, finding ways to build sort of the safety and prevention of these sorts of things. I think in each one of you talked about the challenges, and especially globally, with vulnerable populations and at-risk populations. So what ideas, or what are your thoughts about ways to strengthen families, even among the most vulnerable children?
Yeah, again, I would just point back to that framework. The way that we come around families is just, it's with empathy and relationship. And so it's building that connection so that they trust us, particularly where we work in Thailand on the border of Myanmar. These families are very scared of the government. They're very scared of any kind of authority figure, just because of their own government. And so helping them understand that you're an ally. And I think that that's true even in vulnerable communities here in the States, where you have people that are not as prone to go to the police because of various reasons, obviously. And so helping families know that you're with them is really a big piece of it, that social workers operate with empathy and with understanding, and then helping connect them to concrete supports so that they're able to stabilize. If it's a family in crisis, quite often we see that breaking point is where kids are most vulnerable, where a family is at a major crisis and then they might end up giving their child to someone else to care for them, or they'll leave their child in an unsafe or with someone who's unfit. And so helping understand those needs and then responding to those needs can help prevent a lot of the breakdown that makes children exponentially vulnerable to trafficking. That's what we've seen.
I mean, I think also, particularly in the US, you know, to strengthen families who are troubled or in need, we have to strengthen child welfare. And we know, or at least in Ohio, we helped to pass a law that said child trafficking is child abuse. And so we shifted the primary institution from being juvenile court to child welfare. But we didn't bring one more dime to the system. So in essence, we are breaking the system. In Ohio, we have a mass exodus going on between the opiate epidemic, and now we visited all of these kids, by the way, very mobile people, not little kids that are in cribs, but people that can get mad and leave. So requiring different types of models for child welfare, but we haven't adequately funded child welfare to be able to strengthen families that need their help. So I think we have to start there with federal and state laws to strengthen, to take it seriously, to not make it a political plug for themselves, but to actually work on funding child welfare to a level where they can actually provide good, adequate, effective care.
Yes, and I would love to add, and if we are going to have children involved in child welfare, let's recognize how traumatizing and stressful that can be for especially Black, Indigenous people of color. The research is clear. I even heard my colleague mention Amy about Dr. Sari about disproportionately Black and Indigenous children in particular. At every point of the decision-making process is disproportionately represented and have disparate outcomes. That speaks volumes to me. So it does suggest that these individuals are coming into contact with child welfare for a variety of reasons, but we have to put the human piece in that. And so if we can divert them out of the child welfare system, let's do that first and foremost. But they're going to stay in there. Let's recognize our shortcomings, our biases, and get them out as quickly as possible. And if we do not want to weaponize poverty against impoverished individuals. So if the child is being neglected, let's work on what needs the family needs, what the needs, let's meet those needs of the family members instead of continuing to punish those families. Because the longer the child stays in a system, the decreased chance of that child going back home decreases. And we know that being away from your family as a child is traumatizing. You may think these kids are hard and they're rough and they can do it. As someone who was in a group home for 2 years, these tough children, these independent Black girls, these strong Black boys, these Latinx children, they were traumatized. This was very difficult. I need the child welfare providers to understand how difficult this is for the child and their families.
I'm seeing a number of questions related to the police and law enforcement. Maybe some of them have to do with why isn't child sex trafficking or sex trafficking of minors a priority over some of the other things that they choose as, you know, their priorities. Is law enforcement receiving training, especially around trauma and working with victims who are traumatized? And also, are they being trained to use assessment tools that kind of help them get a better handle on whether or not it's a child who's being sex trafficked is sitting in front of them? So can you speak to any of those? I know it's a lot, but there's like several of them having to do with law enforcement.
Yeah, at least for Ohio, I'm not familiar with Michigan, and Jacqueline or Ashley, you might fill in, but Ohio, we set it up to have, and across the country, so I know there's some in Michigan, but we have law enforcement task forces. So along with coalitions that are diverse, we have task forces that are law enforcement. In Toledo, where I am, we have an FBI and then regional police, including our city police. And every law enforcement officer in Ohio has to be trained on human trafficking, what it looks like, how to identify it. And then, but they don't work the case. We don't have the regular Joe cop on the street work the case. because you have to understand the organized aspect, the organized crime aspect of it. And I don't mean like maybe the Japanese Yakuza, the mafia or whatever, they may be included, but just the organization of all the links in the chain to make this enterprise work. And so a task force can understand that, they can investigate that, they can not just arrest the link in the chain, but they can take the entire chain out. And so across the country, there are these task forces that are very well trained, and they engage with the victim using a victim-centered approach and not an interrogation approach. And so that's their trauma-informed piece. And so they are working those cases. Now that is the conceptual understanding. Of course, there's always, you know, what happens in reality, but that is the intention, I think, behind it.
Yes, I would love to respond to that question as well, because I have had personally, as a scholar activist, positive experiences with vice officers here in Columbus and in Buffalo, New York. They were the ones who actually drove me around in their unmarked cars to find women and kids on the street. And the experience has been positive as a whole. At the same time, when I think about the responsibilities of vice, for example, I've had officers to tell me they have more important crimes to consider than people on the street as prostitutes. And so I think that some officers do not see it as a serious crime, a serious offense, and find themselves being very dismissive about it. While others, especially those who are to community policing, take this very seriously and work with task force and NGOs and people like Cecile and I to do this work. I think it's an uneven mix of bags in terms of how law enforcement helps or hinders the work around anti-trafficking.
I would just respond. I think I can add a little bit of just from the international experience as well. What we see quite often, again, similar to here, is that there's not funding for the child welfare department. And so where there are strong commitments made to anti-trafficking work, and there's obviously a pull in most countries to want to not be on the tier 3 or the tier 2 watch list in the trafficking in persons report, where they are trying to make verbalize commitments, but they're not necessarily being implemented on the ground. And quite often what we'll even see is that governments will take a case of, in Thailand specifically, a case of smuggling, where people are being smuggled to a bigger city to work, and they'll convict that and turn that into a case and then call it trafficking, so that it is more, they're showing that they are doing their job, that they are taking action against trafficking. And so on the ground level, you just have a lot of mistrust where there's government officials that are not funded as well. Even the police are not well funded. So it's their pocket money to bribe people on the streets or to bribe people for deportation. And so there's just not a lot of trust. And so I think even where there are cases of children being abused in communities or there's children being trafficked, they wouldn't report that to the government necessarily. And we see that just in similar places in Tanzania and other places where we work. So I think it is that where that lack of social work, truly the lack of social service workforce is a huge issue internationally. And it's something that a lot of people are talking about, but it's really difficult without the funding for that to ever come to fruition.
Agreed. So there's a couple of other, maybe I'm going to say that maybe our simple answer could be, one of them is it has to do with the gender of minors being trafficked. So the question is, are girls more trafficked than boys?
I mean, at least in the research that I've done, we see more girls, but we also see boys upwards of 25%. And then transgender communities. So yeah, I would say from what we see, more girls. Now, I don't know if that's a product of, you know, boys not always wanting, depending if they're ethnic, and not wanting to disclose, and they're more difficult to disclose. That's also, I'm sure, a factor of it. But the vulnerability of girls, particularly in my research, I just see more girls and less group homes and less opportunities for girls to be housed, frankly.
Yeah, and I would add, I think it varies greatly on the market where they are. I can just personally attest to what I've seen and what I have seen and experienced abroad. I know when it came to domestic health in homes, it was mainly girls. When it came to adults coming to part of this particular country on sex tours, they had mainly boys they were picking up for the hotels. And when it comes to women who were being and girls prostituted out, it was again mainly women and girls. So it varied based on the industry.
I actually think that's probably what the question was, and that I have in my own mind this idea that it's not, minors are not just sex trafficked. I mean, they're involved in other types of trafficking as well, right? I mean, so when we talk about, sex trafficking, we're also talking about labor exploitation. We're talking about servitude. We're talking about, other things within just the population. I think, Jacqueline, your point about, depends on what it is, what they're being trafficked for, right? And I think that's sort of the challenge right now. It's, yeah. So it's yeah, minors are being trafficked, but in different ways, but they're all sort of involved in the human trafficking.
And then
issue.
it's also not just I'm trafficking you for sex to sell sex, but I'm going to open credit cards in your name. When you get old enough, I'm going to get cash payday loans under your, any way to get money or to be exploited, of course, is going to be used.
Celia, there's a question about the 3 T's. If you wanted to, I think there's a question that said, can you remind us what the 3 T's were?
Yeah, so there's trauma-informed care, which is us, the professional, who's wearing our trauma glasses so that when somebody's behaving, feeling, thinking about whatever, we can see it through a trauma lens. They're in the fight, the flight, freeze, whatever, that this is a trauma. They're responding because of their trauma. They're responding in a certain way. And we have to be knowledgeable about that. But that because we're more knowledgeable about that, it doesn't translate into their healing. So everybody that has suffered complex or chronic trauma at least should go to a trauma treatment therapist. They should have trauma treatment therapy from somebody who is certified in trauma in some modality, whether it's EMDR, whether it's trauma focused cognitive behavioral care, whatever the modality is. And then all of us that is involved in that person's life should be focused on providing trauma care, meaning all the things that were taken from them in the trauma experience, we have to be working on putting back. Their boundaries were taken. There were no boundaries, sexual boundaries, physical, emotional boundaries. We have to help them with boundaries because that helps them heal. Relationships, dysfunctional. We have to help them learn to have healthy relationships. Trust, mistrust has been taken. We have to help put trust back. All of those things that were taken, that's a trauma-focused type of work. It's trauma-informed is not good enough. It's critical, but not good enough. We're not done.
I am so glad you put it that way, Silly, because it's been my experience when it comes to trafficked people, many are not even aware they're traumatized. Things have been so bad in so many ways, they don't necessarily recognize it as trauma. They know they feel sad and angry, irritable. So we have to even teach them what trauma is, whether it's intergenerational, historical, or from child trafficking or human trafficking as a whole.
Exactly. And that's where we have to understand. Being a victim of trauma myself, I thought I couldn't focus when I was trying to read if I'm in a cafeteria because I'm hypervigilant because of my experience 20 years ago. I'm thinking I'm ADD. I'm not ADD. I can focus. I'm hypervigilant. I can't focus in a crowd of people because I have to be concerned about my safety. I have to be looking around. Once I learned that, I could study quietly. So once you understand your trauma, you can come up with interventions that help you with your trauma. But if you don't understand it, your worker doesn't understand it, nobody understands. You just think you're going around acting like this for no apparent reason. It's just you. And that's not accurate.
So at this point, what I want to do is, I know we're in our last leg of this conference. So I wanted to just reflect on some of my thinking as you were talking, and also as I've kind of had the opportunity to review your notes and all, and just share some of my thinking on this day. So I want to first thank Amy for reminding us of Rosemary Sari and her energy and the commitment that she brought, and the fierce resolve as a social worker in search of socially just and responsive child welfare practices. Today, we've talked about human trafficking and sex trafficking of minors that highlights the risks of vulnerable youth, many of whom we showcase by congregating them in institutional and residential care, as Ashley's discussed, or fostering them in systems designed to safeguard their welfare and prepare them with life skills, and that too often fall short of those goals. They're often leaving systems of care with and without parental and caregiver knowledge or connection, and are either cast out, thrown out, sold out, run away, or otherwise separated from enduring protective relationships. As Jacqueline says, these children have been relegated to the periphery. Today, we hope to bring these minor victims to the center and out of our blind spots. We see it as a global and a trans-regional problem that transcends a country's economic development. In practice, we remain disconnected with our micro-level focus by ignoring the complexities of the macro level and profitable issues. And while we become overwhelmed by the complexities of structural and systemic facilitators of the problem and barriers and obstacles to sustain solutions, we must remain mindful, as Celia reminds us, of the lifelong impact of trafficking on minor victims. Trafficking minor victims involves a power dynamic and a sophisticated web of deceit and perpetration that extends beyond common myths and beyond sex. It often includes other forms of human trafficking, such as forced labor, servitude, bondage, and forced prostitution. It utilizes sophisticated technology on the one hand, with mixed, unsophisticated maneuvering that exploits not just the minors, but the systems in place that are designated to protect these children. The risks of sex trafficking minors is accentuated by our uncertain means of reporting, responding, and preventing its trauma. Sex trafficking minors illuminates our deficit understanding of the impact of trauma, its immediate needs, and its long-term consequences. It is the trauma of being used and broken. It includes secondary trauma related to the loneliness, perhaps ethical loneliness, knowing that sex trafficking is so inhumane, so perverse, yet with these minors, one can only imagine their wonderment about who cares. Too often it's their silence that begs for someone to notice. And when it is noticed, too often, these minor victims face disappointment, sometimes further victim blaming, discouragement, and hopelessness. Today, we see the two faces of trauma among minor victims of human trafficking: trauma from within, and even more trauma once removed and filtered through a similar experience of the dehumanization of helping rather than caring. And even in our efforts to do good, we miss signals from minor victims who engage in learned behaviors, such as masking and pretending and covering up, which so often they find useful during their trafficking to draw away suspicion and distrust. Helping poses different risks, but rather than desensitize minor victims, we often resensitize these victims. Recovery for sexually exploited minors challenges them to erase the senses that remind them of their abusers and their abuse. It involves the near inconceivable expectation that they can control their life. In the 3 T's of trauma work, Sela reminds us that trauma care of minors who are sex trafficked must endure the fear, distrust, social disconnection, and inability to shed the deeply ingrained and often visible scars that stigmatize them of their sex abuse. Where the search for healing touch gets lost, as Ashley was talking about, the empowerment and control that includes voice may eventually find ears that hear, but this is the long-term hope, which prior to and enduring their abuse was likely abandoned. Trauma-informed care is a lens from which we view victimhood, but can only be appreciated by giving up the role of helper, by experiencing through humility the depth of the minor victim's despair. I would argue that the work of recovery begins from where the minor is forced to begin. It is the toxicity of body violence in minors that blinds these youthful victims of joy, close relationships, and wonder that comes from curiosity, otherwise born out of safety and security, a warm embrace, and innocent touch that for victims becomes filtered through memories of imprisonment, aggression, and deference. Power takes on a very different meaning to minor victims who never had power, or else with what little power they had, abdicated under the influence of deception and fear of an unknown outside of their abuse. The hold over them includes forced and self-medicating drugs and alcohol use, financial dependence, isolation, and knowledge withheld. We conclude with cautious optimism, as there is substantial and compelling evidence to indicate the problem of human and sex trafficking of minors is real, that it is recognized as increasingly problematic and has both immediate and long-term adverse consequences for minors and for us as a society. The fact that we're discussing the clear and present dangers of sexual exploitation of minors reveals our failure in preventing it. Yet we have increased our coordination and community-based collaborative efforts, but we remain in our infancy. Lessons learned from COVID tell us we have more work to do. We're calling on improved legislation, financial support, training, and maintaining a stable workforce, and greater public awareness of the signs and symptoms of minor sex trafficking and exploitation. We look for more evidence-based practices with minor victims of human trafficking, and when we continue to look for ways to disrupt incentives to exploit minors, holding perpetrators accountable, establishing laws and incentives to remove perpetrators from opportunities to exploit minors, increasing information sharing within and across jurisdictions, and building effective strategies to confront, disrupt, and dismantle structural and social barriers to prevention, and to do more than enough to promote family well-being, belonging, and child safety. We are all responsible.
That makes my heart feel happy. Thank you so very much.
I just want you to know you were heard.
That was beautiful. Thank
Love
you.
it.
I want to get a copy of that.
Yeah.
So usually what we do is we will sort of do this we have an alumnus news, like a, what do you call it? Like a short little journal kind of thing that we will put this in, and we'll make sure you get a copy of it. So at this point, if anybody else has any last words, or I think we might have said we have 15 minutes we can give back to everybody unless anybody else has anything to say. Emma, I don't know if we want to end today or.
We certainly can. We do have a couple more questions. I don't know if you want to answer any more questions or if we want to call it. I'll leave it up to anyone.
How are you feeling? You want to answer many more questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
we had a couple more at the bottom while you actually were speaking, Robert. If you look at like
okay.
15, 14, and 16.
Okay, so one has to do with child welfare. Does child welfare need to mean only removal? Can it be support to keep families together?
I love that question. I love that question. Thank you for asking it. I wish we would adopt a model that focuses on family preservation instead of family separation. Absolutely.
I agree.
Another question is, what are the signs we can look for in public, non-professional settings and roles that someone might be trafficked?
I think there's some good, really good information on polarisproject.org of signs to look for, but individually, one thing may not mean a whole lot, but when you start to put things together, they might start to put a picture together for you. And maybe you didn't have a name for it before, but now you do. And it makes you feel uneasy in your gut. It makes it something is not, I don't feel something's wrong here. And maybe that's what is wrong. And so it might be somebody who ran away. It might be somebody who has a hotel room key cards. It might be somebody that has a wad of cash, but you know their family or their whole outfit costs no more than $10. Or where did they get that brand new iPhone or that new bling that they have on their arm? Why is their boyfriend 27 and they're only 14? You know, why is this adult person working? You never see them. They don't have a paycheck, or they're putting their paycheck in a bank account that doesn't have their name on it. You know, there are lots and lots of different signs. Why does this person have repeated sexually transmitted infections and you work in a clinic? What's happening? Is this person promiscuous, or are they complying with the demands of someone? There's lots of, you know, and I'm sure my colleagues can add to it, but they add up to something that feels very uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Often. That was well said, my colleague. And I want to just kind of respond to that and add to some of the comments on the bar there about if it feels strange or weird or awkward, you're probably right. But also think about the venue. Are you at a truck stop? Are you at a male attended event, baseball, football, car, Arnold's event? Think about the venue. Think about the number of people in there. Are you at a hotel and some young person keeps using the front desk phone in some small hotel? If it feels a little weird and suspicious, it may be what you think it is.
So I want to make sure that we all know the hotline number. I'm going to put it in the chat, but if you do get that weird feeling, it doesn't add up, but it's outside of what we said, but you still feel funny about it, you can always call the hotline. There's a national hotline number. You don't even have to say who you are. You can give as much information as you can. You don't have to know all the information. You don't even have to know names. You can say dates, places, what they were wearing, what was happening, what made you suspicious. And when you hang up, they will call the task force located close to your location, and they will give them that information. And that might be a piece of the puzzle that is critically needed. You don't know. So don't talk yourself out of it, please, because no harm, no foul if you just call and give the information. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Oh, Jacqueline did. And you can call that, and they are very nice, and they're not going to ask you for your name and all that kind of stuff. Just good information, you know, just take it old school and take care of everybody's children, not just your own. Be looking out for everybody's kids. And that's a good, safe way to do it.
I would just add also that I love that about asking questions, and just keep in mind that they're going to completely act like they want nothing to do with you. So I think that's pushing and leaning in. It might be quite often that they are going to be completely just completely aloof, not want to have conversations, not want to answer questions. But I think just using empathy in those moments and allowing them to just be present and just being patient with that might be something to push through when you do have that gut feeling.
Great. So there's one more. I think we have time for one more. It says, can you discuss how technology has been used in trafficking and whether it can be used to help liberate or convict traffickers?
Yeah, I mean, it's great evidence, the written word on social media.
The paper trail.
It's great evidence for a task force to use to convict someone. So, but yeah, the internet, of course, and everybody on this call understands that the internet has been used in every kind of business, even the underground business, and it has increased business. And it helps me if I'm the trafficker. I can understand your vulnerabilities, and that's of course what I'm going to exploit. I can understand your vulnerabilities that much quicker when you're talking on social media, whether you're talking to me or not yet. I can understand if you say, you know, oh, look at this, look at my outfit here, look at how I look here. You're saying to me that you want to be found attractive. So guess how I'm going to approach you? Oh, hey, baby girl, you're looking good. I'm going to get, because I understand your vulnerability is the need to feel attractive. Oh, my parents don't listen to me. I can't wait to get out of here. Okay, I see that your vulnerability is you want to be treated like an adult and you don't want to listen to your parents. Good for me. I can talk to you in a way that appeals to you in that way. So absolutely, I can do that to 3 to 5 vulnerable kids. I don't have to do it one at a time. So technology helps me to do my work faster and quicker. I can set up homes where I say, hey, this weekend we're going to be at this location, and I can text all the victims and I can text all the customers, and my location can keep moving so that law enforcement, it makes it difficult to police it. So yeah, technology absolutely is being used in a bad way and in a good way for evidence.
Right. And then finally, we have one more. What are appropriate questions to ask when speaking with a possible victim?
I think that's a great question. And by the way, I've never met a victim who knew they were trafficked in my entire career since 1996. So I can't ask them if they were a victim, but I do like to ask questions. Are you safe? Do you need help? Are you at a place or in a position for me to help you? Can we go somewhere? Can I call someone for you? Do you have the authority to leave on your own? Are you feeling afraid for your life? These are the kind of things I ask when I think there's something going on and there may be some imminent danger or urgency in trying to get assistance to the person.
Yeah, you notice Dr. Meshlamaya, first thing she asks is about safety. First thing. Last thing, I mean, she goes into deeper, more intimate, scarier questions as she goes on, but she starts out generalized. Are you safe? That's so important. Safety is so important. No matter what you ask and how you, safety should always be, you know, in the forefront of your mind.
I absolutely agree. I think trust too, we had that conversation as well. I think came up more than once about how, you know, you're in this vulnerable situation. I think that's why you're asking about safety, but the question is, do you trust who this person is who's standing in front of me asking me questions?
And know that 3 to 5 times the research says that they will lie because they don't trust, because their customers look just like you, because their customers came from professions just like yours. And so why would they trust, right? So you can expect this is not somebody non-compliant, or they are non-compliant for very good reasons. So you can expect not to hear the truth or the full truth, the half truths for a lot of times, because that trust, that mistrust is there. So that's expected.
All right, one question, I thought that would be the last one, just popped in. Can any of the speakers comment on the major areas of concern they see with children who experience labor trafficking in the US?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen, at least in Ohio, we've seen in terms of domestic or citizens who are kids, we've seen candy sales, magazine sales, that they don't really have the proper, you know, materials to show you that this is for their school band or whatever. And so, but with Americans, it's been candy sales, magazine sales, and that sort of thing, and labor trafficking. At schools, you know, it's been people renting houses, 8 people live there that are unrelated. And you're like, wait a minute, you know, like, how is this happening and what's going on here? And there'll be foreign students, or, you know, you see labor trafficking in, you know, I know in Columbus, hair braiding, and you've seen, you know, ethnic restaurants and things like that, kids standing all day on their feet, braiding hair and doing things like that. So, I mean, that's what I would add.
Anything else? So Jacqueline, Ashley, and Celia, thank you on behalf of the University of Michigan and the Fedele Fauri Lecture. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you all of the viewers who are here listening to this conference. Thank you so much. You were all awesome. This is a great day. Hopefully you'll have some takeaways. And this will maybe keep us involved to keep our children safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.